There's something slightly unusual about our solar system, not in a dramatic science fiction kind of way, nothing that immediately stands out when you look at a textbook diagram, but in the quieter details, the ones that don't quite resolve cleanly no matter how long you stare at them. Between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter, there's a vast region filled with debris, rock, metal, fragments, what we call the asteroid belt. Now, on paper, it's explained simply enough material that never quite formed into a planet held back by the gravitational influence of Jupiter, prevented from ever coming together into something whole. And to be fair, that explanation works, mostly. But for a long time, scientists considered another possibility that this wasn't just leftover material, but the remains of something that once was whole. A planet that, for one reason or another, no longer exists. Not far from there, just one orbit inward, another mystery sits in plain sight: Mars, a world that today is cold, dry, and silent. Its surface shaped by dust storms and radiation, but one that, according to a growing body of evidence, was once very different. Ancient river valleys, minerals that only form in the presence of liquid water, geological features that suggest not just moisture, but oceans. A planet that may have once been habitable, and yet something happened. Its magnetic field weakened, its atmosphere thinned, its water disappeared, and whatever potential it once held faded into the barren world we see today. Two places, one that is now in a million pieces, and one that clearly lost the ability to sustain life. Two anomalies sitting quietly in the same system with no obvious connection between them. At least, not one that conventional explanations are trying to make. But what if these aren't just geological stories? What if they're not just about rock, gravity, and atmosphere, but about something far less visible? The beings who may have lived there, and what happened to them when their worlds could no longer support them? Because if that question is worth asking, then Earth might not be where the story begins. It might be where it continues. Before going any further, it's worth slowing down and looking at what we actually know. Because, as unusual as those earlier observations might feel, they're not speculation. They're based on decades of measurement, observation, and revision, the slow, methodical process by which science tries to reduce mystery without ever quite eliminating it. The region between Mars and Jupiter is not empty. It contains millions of objects, ranging from microscopic dust to bodies hundreds of kilometers across, all orbiting the sun in a loosely organized band, what we call the asteroid belt. At first glance, it might seem like the remnants of something massive, the scattered pieces of a destroyed world, but modern measurements tell a more nuanced story. The total mass of the entire asteroid belt is surprisingly small. In fact, if you were to gather all of its material together, it wouldn't even form a body as large as Earth's moon, which raises an immediate problem for the quote unquote exploded planet idea. There simply isn't enough material left to account for a full size world. So the prevailing scientific explanation today is different. Rather than a planet that was destroyed, the asteroid belt is thought to be a planet that never formed. In the early solar system, as dust and gas began to coalesce into larger bodies, this region likely tried to form a planet. But the immense gravitational influence of Jupiter, sitting just beyond it, continuously disrupted that process. Instead of coming together, the material remained scattered, prevented from ever becoming whole. Still, the idea that something once existed there, something more complete, has never fully disappeared from discussion. It lingers, not as a dominant theory, but as a question that never quite goes away. If the asteroid belt represents something that never fully became, Mars represents something that did. Because unlike the belt, Mars shows clear, measurable signs that it once existed in a radically different state. Satellite imagery has revealed vast networks of dried riverbeds, channels carved into the surface that strongly suggest the long term flow of liquid water. Rovers analyzing Martian soil have identified minerals that only form in the presence of water, not briefly, but persistently. And perhaps most compelling of all, there is strong evidence that Mars once had a much thicker atmosphere, dense enough to support stable liquid water on its surface, dense enough to protect it from the kind of radiation that now bombards it freely. Which leads to a critical question: what happened? Current models suggest that Mars lost this global magnetic field very early in its history, and without that magnetic protection, solar wind, constant streams of charged particles from the sun, began to strip away the planet's atmosphere over millions of years. Not violently, not all at once, but gradually, relentlessly, until the pressure dropped, The temperatures fell, and the water either froze or escaped into space. In other words, Mars didn't simply fail to support life, it may have lost the ability to support it. So, what we're left with is this: a region in our solar system where a planet never quite came together, or perhaps never remained together, and another where once a more hospitable world became inhospitable. Two separate cases, two separate explanations, both grounded in physics, observation, and evidence. And yet, when you step back and look at them side by side, it becomes difficult not to notice that both are, in their own way, stories of interruption, of something that didn't complete its trajectory, or something that did, and then lost it. And if that's all they are, then the story ends there. Just physics, just time, just the natural evolution of planetary systems. But if there's more to the story, then the next question isn't about planets at all. It's about something far less visible: the possibility that consciousness itself might follow trajectories that can also be interrupted. Up to this point, everything we've talked about sits comfortably within the boundaries of conventional science: observations, models, best fit explanations based on available data. And to be clear, none of that is being dismissed. If anything, it's necessary. Because without a grounded understanding of what we can measure, it becomes very easy to believe things simply because they're interesting. And as history has shown, interesting is not always the same as accurate. Although, to be fair, it does tend to be more entertaining. But there's another way of approaching these same observations, not as contradictions to science, but as questions that science has not yet fully answered, a different lens. One that doesn't replace what we know, but attempts to extend it into areas that are harder to measure. This particular lens comes from a body of material known as the Law of One, not as a belief system, not as something to accept or reject outright, but as a framework, a way of organizing ideas about consciousness, evolution, and the relationship between mind and environment. At its core, the framework suggests something relatively simple: that consciousness is not produced by the brain, but expressed through it. That life is not a random emergence, but part of a structured process of development, one that unfolds in stages, often referred to as densities. In this model, planets are not just physical objects drifting through space, they are environments, classrooms in a sense, each one offering specific conditions designed to facilitate particular kinds of experience. Which is an idea that sounds abstract at first, until you realize we already describe Earth in almost exactly those terms: a place where life develops, where conditions shape behavior, where environment influences outcome, just usually without calling it a classroom. Probably because if we did, it would raise some uncomfortable questions about who's grading. Within this framework, the development of consciousness doesn't happen all at once. It progresses from simple awareness to self awareness to increasingly complex understandings of identity, choice, and connection. And each stage, each density, requires a suitable environment in order to unfold properly, which leads to a more unusual implication. If consciousness develops across multiple environments, then it doesn't necessarily begin and end on the same planet. In other words, a world is not always a starting point. Sometimes it's a continuation. And this is where the framework begins to intersect with the anomalies we looked at earlier. Because according to this perspective, Earth is not just home to life that originated here, it is also home to life that arrived. Not in the sense of spacecraft or physical migration, but through something more subtle: incarnation. The idea that consciousness, having developed in one environment, can continue its experience in another. Which, if taken seriously, even just as a thought experiment, raises a very different kind of question. Not just what happened to those planets, but what happened to the beings who may have been developing there when those environments could no longer support them? And if they didn't just simply disappear, then where did that experience go? Where did that consciousness continue? According to this framework, some of it ended up here. Within this framework, there is a reference to a world that once existed in the region we now associate with the asteroid belt. A world that has had a few names in our society, but many refer to it as Maldek. Not a fragment, not debris, but at one time a completely planetary environment, one capable of supporting third density experience, a stage of development where self awareness, choice, and polarity become the central focus. And according to the Law of One, the beings who inhabited this world were not primitive. They had reached what is described as a high level of technological advancement. the kind that allows a civilization to shape its environment rather than simply adapt to it, which, historically speaking, is usually where things start to get complicated. In session 10.1, the description is direct and unusually stark. The peoples of Maldek had a civilization somewhat similar to that of the societal complex known to you as Atlantis, in that it gained much technological information and used it without care for the preservation of their sphere, following to a majority extent the complex of thought, ideas, and actions, which you may associate with your so called negative polarity or the service to self. This was, however, for the most part, couched in a sincere belief thought structure which seemed to the perception of the mind body complexes of the sphere to be positive and of service to others. The devastation that racked their biosphere and caused its disintegration resulted from what you call war. Not a gradual decline, not a slow collapse, a disintegration. Approximately 705,000 years ago, this civilization reached what could be described as the pinnacle of its development, and then, through escalating conflict and the unchecked use of its own technology, it destroyed its biosphere, and ultimately, the planet itself. But what follows is where the account becomes far more unusual, because the material does not describe this as the end of those who live there. Instead, it describes something else entirely. The entities were so traumatized by this occurrence that they were in what you may call a social complex knot or tangle of fear. Not death in the conventional sense, but a kind of collapse of awareness. The trauma was described as so profound that these entities effectively lost the recognition that they were conscious, that they existed, that they were, which is difficult to even conceptualize because it suggests a state where experience continues, but without identity, without orientation, without the ability to interpret what is happening. Not punishment, not judgment, but consequence in its most raw and unfiltered form. And perhaps more unsettling than the destruction itself is the implication that the most significant damage was not to the planet, but to the consciousness of those who destroyed it, which is not exactly the kind of technological milestone you'd want to celebrate. Because if the framework is accurate, then what happened to Maldek was not just the loss of a world, but the creation of a condition that would take hundreds of thousands of years to even begin to untangle. And that untangling did not happen all at once. What followed the destruction of Maldek was not immediate recovery, not a rebuilding, not a relocation, but a prolonged state of disorientation. The material describes these entities as remaining within that knot of fear, a condition so deeply embedded that it effectively suspended their ability to function as self aware beings. And for a significant period of time, there was no progress, no movement forward, no sense of direction at all, which, depending on how you look at it, is a kind of inertia. Not physical, but experiential. Because if consciousness loses its sense of self, then even time, as we understand it, begins to lose meaning. According to the material, this state persisted for hundreds of thousands of years, until eventually something external intervened. In session 10.1, it is described this way. The Confederation were able to deploy a social memory complex and untie the knot of fear. The entities were then able to recall that they were conscious. This awareness brought them to a point upon what you would call the lower astral planes, where they could be nurtured until each mind body spirit complex was able finally to be healed of this trauma to the extent that each entity was able to examine the distortions it had experienced in the previous life illusion complex. Not through force, not through correction, but through a kind of steady, patient offering, which admittedly is not the usual approach taken when something goes catastrophically wrong. And even then, the process was not immediate. The material suggests that it took until roughly 200,000 years ago before this intervention reached a threshold where the entities could begin to regain some degree of awareness. That's hundreds of thousands of years after their destruction. Just to put that into perspective, that's not a recovery measured in years or even generations, but in spans of time that stretch far beyond recorded human history, which reframes the idea of consequence in a way that's difficult to ignore. Because this wasn't a punishment imposed from the outside, it was a condition that emerged from the actions themselves and then had to be unwound slowly, carefully, without force. And eventually, something began to change. The material describes a point at which a portion of these entities reach what would be called a realization, a movement toward a less distorted orientation, towards cooperation rather than conflict, toward what the framework would describe as service to others. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough to allow the next step. Because once that shift occurred, once a threshold of that collective decided to reorient, the question was no longer how did they recover, but rather where did they go next? And the answer was not another world like the one they had lost. It was something much more primitive. Once a portion of the Maldek population reached a sufficient level of reorientation, not perfection, not full clarity, but simply a movement away from the distortions that had led them to their collapse, the next phase could begin, a return to physical experience, but not in the form that they had known before. According to the material, these entities did not immediately return to third density, self aware bodies. Instead, they began again in a more foundational state. In session 10.3, it is described like this: the alleviation mechanism was designed by the placement of this consciousness in second dimensional physical chemical complexes, which are not able to be dexterous or manipulative to the extent which is appropriate to the workings of the third density distortions of the mind complex. Apes. Not as punishment, not as a regression in the sense of failure, but as a recalibration, a way of re entering experience with less complexity, less power, and perhaps fewer opportunities to repeat the same distortions too quickly. Which, depending on how you look at it, is either incredibly humbling or the most extreme version of we need to start over ever recorded. These early incarnations marked the beginning of a long process of redevelopment, one that would eventually allow these entities to once again reach self awareness within a third density environment. But the details don't stop there, because according to the material, not all of these incarnations occurred on the surface of the planet. In session 6.13, it is stated: the ones who were harvested to your sphere from the sphere known before its dissolution as other names, but to your peoples as Maldek, incarnated, many within your Earth's surface rather than upon it. Which introduces a detail that is, at the very least, unusual. The idea that part of this population began its return to physical experience not in open environments, but in more enclosed, subterranean conditions. I'm reminded of legends from our ancestors describing how life emerged from underground. And alongside this, another broader point is made, one that shifts the narrative away from a single origin story entirely. Also in session 6.13, the population of your planet contains many various groups harvested from other second dimension and cycle third dimension spheres. You are not all one race or background of beginning. The experience you share is unique to this time space continuum. In other words, Earth, within this framework, is not the product of a single evolutionary line. It is a convergence point, a melting pot, a place where multiple streams of development, some native, some transferred, some recovering, all intersect. Which means that the idea of where we come from may not have a single answer, it may have many. And for some of those who originated on Maldek, this process of recovery did not end with a return to third density form. For some, it continued in ways that are still ongoing, in ways that may still exist alongside us, but just outside what we normally expect to see. Because in this case, the material remains surprisingly specific. For some of the entities associated with Maldek, the process of recovery did not follow a uniform path. While many were eventually able to continue developing, moving back towards third density experience and in some cases even graduating beyond it, others remained in earlier stages, not permanently, not as failure, but as part of a longer process that had not yet fully resolved. Karma still lingers. In session 9.18, the material makes a statement that, at first glance, sounds almost out of place given everything we've discussed so far. Some of the entities from Maldek are working their understanding complexes through a series of what you would call karmic restitutions. They dwell within your deeper underground passageways and are known to you as Bigfoot. It's a line that could easily be dismissed, filed away with folklore, cryptid reports, and a long list of things that tend to appear right at the edge of credibility. And to be fair, that's usually where the word Bigfoot lives. Somewhere between blurry photos, forest documentaries, and that one friend who is way too confident about what they saw on a camping trip. But within this framework, the claim is not presented as a mystery to be solved or a creature to be proven. It's presented as a stage, a continuation of development for entities that are still working through the distortions created long before on a different world. which reframes the idea entirely, not as something hidden, but as something unresolved. And importantly, this is not described as the fate of all Maldek entities. In session 10.4, it's clarified many of these entities were able to remove the accumulation of what you call karma, thus being able to accept a third density cycle within a third density body. Most of those beings so succeeding have incarnated elsewhere in the creation for the succeeding cycle and third density, meaning they moved on, continued their development elsewhere, while others remain in forms that are less complex, less self aware, but still a part of the same overarching process, which introduces a subtle but important idea that development is not synchronized. Even within the same origin, beings move at different rates, resolve different things, choose different paths. Now, if you want a deeper breakdown of how this framework categorizes the different types of Bigfoot that are described, we actually cover that in a previous episode where we go into the distinctions in a bit more detail. So if you're sitting there thinking, wait, there are multiple types? Yeah, that rabbit hole already exists. But for the purposes of this discussion, the important point isn't the classification, it's the implication that what we sometimes interpret as myth, legend, or misidentification may, within certain frameworks, be understood as something else entirely, a different stage of the same continuum we're part of. And while the Maldek narrative is one example of a civilization that reached a point of collapse, it is not the only one described, because according to the Law of One, another group from a different world arrived here even earlier, not after destroying their planet, but after slowly making it uninhabitable. While the events associated with Maldek are described as sudden, violent, and catastrophic, the narrative surrounding Mars unfolds differently, not as a single moment of destruction, but as a gradual breakdown of conditions necessary for life. According to the material, the entities who once inhabited Mars had reached a stage of third density development, a level of awareness where choice, polarity, and collective behavior begin to influence the trajectory of a civilization. But instead of a single catastrophic event, their difficulties emerged over time. In session 9.10, it is described directly. The tendencies of these entities towards bellicose actions caused such difficulties in the atmospheric environment of their planet that it became inhospitable for third density experience before the end of its cycle. That wording is important because it does not describe a purely natural planetary process, nor does it suggest a simple mechanical cause and effects relationship. Instead, it points to something more integrated, a civilization whose collective tendencies, particularly towards conflict, separation, and aggressive expressions of power, were in some way entangled with the condition of the environment itself. Not necessarily in the sense that individuals directly alter the atmosphere, but that the trajectory of the civilization and the stability of the environment were not independent of one another. From a scientific standpoint, Mars still presents a clear example of a world that changed dramatically over time. A planet that once had a thicker atmosphere, stable liquid water, conditions potentially suitable for life, and then lost them. Whether through the loss of its magnetic field, solar wind stripping its atmosphere, or other large scale planetary processes, the physical explanation remains largely within natural mechanisms. And it's worth noting that planetary environments, including Earth's, are understood to undergo long term changes as part of natural cycles, fluctuations, shifts, transitions over time, which makes the Martian account less about assigning blame and more about recognizing that a civilization's trajectory may not be entirely separate from the world it inhabits. Eventually, the Martian environment reached a point where continuation of third density experience was no longer viable, not because consciousness ended, but because the environment could no longer support it. And just like Maldek, that raised the same question: what happens next? Because while the Martian entities were transferred to Earth approximately 75,000 years ago, another group was moving through a very different path of recovery. Following the untangling of their condition, a portion of the Maldek population eventually reached a point where they could once again sustain third density experience. And according to the material, that occurred approximately 46,000 years ago, which means that Earth, within this framework, became something more than a single origin world. It became a convergence point where different populations from different planetary histories entered into the same environment at different times, carrying different trajectories of experience. Not all beginning together, not all beginning the same way, but all continuing. And in this case of the Martian entities, their arrival here was not entirely untouched, because as they entered this new environment here on Earth, something else occurred, something intentional. If the Martian transfer had been a simple relocation, a movement of consciousness from one environment to another, then the story would end there. A dying world, an inhabitable one, and a continuation of experience. But according to the material, that transition involves something more. Not just movement, but modification. In session 9.7, it is stated that as the entities from Mars were transferred to Earth, they were also genetically altered, which at first sounds like a dramatic claim, but within the framework being presented, it is described in a very specific way. Not as experimentation, not as a manipulation for control, but as an adjustment, a modification of the physical vehicle, the body, so that it could better function within the conditions of a new environment. Because if consciousness is continuing its development, but the environment has changed, then the form it uses to interact with that environment may also need to change. Which, when you put it that way, sounds a lot less like science fiction and a lot more like updating software to run on a different system. According to the material, this process was carried out by what is referred to as the Yahweh group complex. In session 18.20, it is stated, the Yahweh group worked with those of the planet you call Mars 75,000 years ago in what you would call the cloning process. And more specifically, in session 18.15, the description adds, some of these genetic changes were in a form similar to what you call the cloning process. Thus, entities incarnated in the image of the Yahweh entities. Now, that phrasing is loaded because it echoes language that appears in much later human traditions. Ideas about being quote unquote made in the image of a creator or a higher form. But within this framework, the statement is not symbolic, it's anatomical, a description of physical resemblance, a shaping of the body to align with a particular template, which introduces a very different way of thinking about human development, not as a purely isolated linear evolution, but as something that may have included interventions, adjustments, moments where the trajectory was guided, not forced, not overridden, but influenced. And importantly, this was not described as a replacement of what already existed on Earth, but as a blending. Because, as we touched on earlier, this planet was not empty. It already hosted its own forms of life, its own developmental processes, its own trajectory, which means that what we now think of as humanity within this framework may not be the result of a single origin, but the convergence of multiple influences, native development, transferred consciousnesses, and modified physical forms, all meeting in the same environment. And when you step back and look at the broader pattern, Maldek, Mars, Earth, it begins to form something less like a collection of isolated events and more like a continuity, a movement of consciousness across environments, carrying with it the results of what came before. Which brings us to a larger question. If multiple civilizations with different histories, different imbalances, and different stages of recovery all converge here, then what exactly is Earth? When you step back from the individual threads, Maldek, Mars, their timelines, their trajectories, what begins to emerge is not just a sequence of events, but a pattern. Different worlds, different outcomes, different forms of imbalance, some sudden, some gradual, but all leading to the same turning point, the inability of a planet to continue supporting the level of experience that was taking place upon it. And in each case, the story does not end with the loss of the environment. It continues. Because within this framework, consciousness is not bound to a single location. It is relocatable, not in the physical sense, but in the continuity of experience, which means that when one environment can no longer sustain that experience, another must. And according to the material, that other was, in many cases, Earth. In session 6.13, it is stated clearly, the population of your planet contains many various groups harvested from other second dimension and cycle third dimension spheres. You are not all one race or background of beginning. The experience you share is unique to this time space continuum. Not one origin, not one lineage, many, which reframes the idea of humanity in a way that is difficult to simplify. Because if this perspective is taken seriously, even just as a conceptual model, then what we're looking at is not a single story of development, but an intersection, a convergence of beings recovered from catastrophic collapse, beings relocated from declining environments, beings native to this planet's own evolutionary processes, and even beings harvesting from other planets in the creation, all sharing the same space, all continuing their development, but not from the same starting point, which may help explain something that is otherwise strangely inconsistent: the wide variation in perspective, in behavior, in orientation. The fact that some individuals seem naturally inclined towards cooperation, while others seem equally inclined towards control, conflict, or separation, which, if nothing else, explains Thanksgiving dinner a little more effectively than most theories. Within this framework, those differences are not random. They are residual, expressions of prior trajectories carried forward into a shared environment, not fixed, not permanent, but present, which turns Earth into something very specific. Not just a planet, not just a place where life happens, but a kind of meeting ground. A space where different histories are given the opportunity to continue, to resolve, to choose again if they so choose. And if that's the case, then what matters here is not where those histories began, but what is done with the continuation. Because when viewed through that lens, Maldek is not just a story of destruction. Mars is not just a story of decline. They're precedents. And Earth is where those precedents are given another chance to move in a different direction, or to repeat themselves. When you look at these narratives side by side, Maldek, Mars, what stands out is not just what happened, but how it happened. Two different worlds, two different timelines, two different expressions of imbalance. One, rapid, catastrophic, driven by escalating conflict and the unchecked use of power. The other, gradual, systemic, shaped over time by persistent tendencies towards aggression and separation. But despite those differences, both arrived at a similar threshold, a point where the environment itself could no longer sustain the level of experience taking place upon it, which suggests something subtle, but difficult to ignore: that the trajectory of a civilization, its choices, its tendencies, its orientation, may not be entirely separate from the conditions of the world it inhabits. Not in a simplified cause and effect way, but in a deeper sense, where consciousness and environment are part of the same system, which is a much less convenient model than everything is random, but also a bit harder to shrug off once you see it. Within the law of one framework, this dynamic is described through the concept of polarity, the idea that at a certain stage of development, consciousness begins to orient itself along one of two primary paths: service to others, which is cooperation, connection, mutual support, or service to self, control, separation, the prioritization of the individual over the whole. And importantly, this framework does not describe one path as forbidden or even wrong. Both are considered valid expressions of development, but they are not identical in how they unfold, because while both paths can progress, they do so under very different conditions. One tends towards integration, the other toward increasing separation. And over time, those orientations begin to shape not just individual experience, but collective reality, the structure of societies, the use of technology, the stability of the environment, which brings the focus back to what we saw earlier: Maldek, a civilization that reached a high level of advancement, but applied that advancement without balance. Mars, a civilization whose persistent tendencies created conditions that gradually became unsustainable. Two different expressions of the same underlying dynamic. And Earth, within this framework, is not separate from that pattern. It is where that pattern continues. Because if consciousness carries its trajectory, if it brings forward the results of what came before, then what exists here now is not a blank slate. It is a continuation, a mixture of histories, of tendencies, of unresolved directions. And within that mixture, the same fundamental choice remains: not imposed, not forced, but present in how individuals think, in how they act, and how they relate to one another and to the world around them. Not as a single defining moment, but as something that unfolds continuously, choice by choice. So, what do we do with this? Two worlds, one that ended in sudden collapse, another that declined slowly until it could no longer sustain what once lived there. Two different paths, but neither one an ending. Because in both cases, What was lost was not consciousness itself, but the environment that supported it. And what followed was not disappearance, it was continuation. According to this framework, the beings from those worlds did not vanish. They carried their experience forward, their tendencies, their distortions, their progress, and eventually they arrived here, which reframes Earth in a way that is easy to overlook, not as a beginning, but as a continuation of multiple beginnings, all unfolding at once. A place where different histories intersect, where different trajectories are given space to continue, and perhaps more importantly, a place where those trajectories can change. Because within this perspective, nothing that has happened is ever truly lost. It is carried, not as a burden, but as a direction. And direction can be adjusted slowly, over time, through choice, not in a single moment of realization, but in the accumulation of smaller ones. So, if there's anything to take from this, it may not be a warning or a lesson in the traditional sense, just an observation that consciousness does not escape its choices, it carries them, and that there are no wrong paths, but some paths take much longer to remember why they were chosen in the first place. And if that's true, then whatever this place is, whatever Earth represents within that larger continuity, it is not where the story begins, and it is not where it ends. It is simply where we are now. Thank you for watching or listening. I wish you all love, light, peace, and joy. Take care.